Our study tonight is Leviticus chapter 24, all the way through chapter 25, verse 24. So pray for me. Father, as we begin tonight, lots of reading, I need your help, Lord. And yet there's so much here that is so valuable to us. Give us ears to hear. Not only that we would pay attention, but that we would be obedient. And Jesus, my prayer throughout this day has been that we would trust you. It's what you want for us, Lord, to trust you. So help us to trust you. Increase our faith. Finally, Lord, I pray that if there's even one person here tonight who isn't born again, I pray that somehow tonight in the book of Leviticus, you would grab their heart. Convince them of just how trustworthy you are, how much you love them, and ask them to join your family. We love you, God. We're so grateful for everything that you've done for us. All of this we ask for your glory. We ask all of this in the beautiful name of a grown-up Jesus. Amen. Of Abraham, it was said, and this is an important distinction, of Abraham, it was said that he believed God. Now, we would read that normally and say, well, he believed in God. But that's not what it says. It says he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Probably everybody in this room believes in God. But the question that our study brings forward tonight is, do you believe him? Do you take him at his word? Now, before you say yes, sure, think about it. Dan Cathy, who is the CEO and founder of Chick-fil-A, all of those decades ago, decided that he was going to honor the Lord's Day. A retail business closing on Sunday, that's craziness in the world that we live in. But they have stayed faithful over and over and over, year after year, again, decade after decade. And no matter the pressure, we know even now as we're here, the state of New York is trying to enact legislation that would force those retail establishments that are on the highways to be open because, well, people traveling need it. And of course, Chick-fil-A is prominent. Not only is it prominent, it's the most popular fast food restaurant, not just in New York, but in the United States. Chick-fil-A is a named building sponsor for Mercedes Stadium in Atlanta, where the Atlanta Falcons play. And they've got restaurants all through the place. You can't walk through that place without seeing Chick-fil-A. But wait a minute, the NFL plays on Sunday, and all of the Chick-fil-A restaurants are closed. People still eat Chick-fil-A. We remember what we did in San Antonio to them. Just a couple of years ago, we forbade them to have a Chick-fil-A in the San Antonio airport. I guess they figured the rest of the food in that airport was so good they didn't need it. Of course, that's not the case. But they legislated them out of our airport because they wouldn't open on Sunday. And the reality is people just hate religion. They hate anything to do with Jesus Christ. And Dan Cathy has stood firm for all of these years because he believed God and he believed that God would honor a business that would honor him. And I repeat, Chick-fil-A is abundantly blessed by God and they are the most popular fast food restaurant in our country. The question for you and for me is, will we believe God? You know, you've never failed me once. We just sang the song. We know that intellectually. But what about when you sense some trouble? Do you believe him? Do you take him at his word? I told you at the very beginning of Leviticus that there would be Bible studies that would be very, very practical for those of us who live in the 21st century. Well, this is one of them. especially as we get to chapter 25. Chapter 24 begins, it says this, "The Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites," and we're going to see that over and over. These are commandments given to Israel. They're not given to you, they're not given to me. We need to read that and understand if we're going to make sense of our Bible. "Command the Israelites to bring you clear or pure, or even better is beaten oil. The best olive oil in the world is that which has been beaten and purified repeatedly. Bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning continually." Now, the lampstand that we're going to talk about tonight is the menorah. It's the enduring symbol of Israel. And it was the only source of light in the tabernacle. Now, obviously, the lamps took a lot of care. The wicks had to be trimmed continuously because the light could never go out in the tabernacle where the presence of God was. Outside the curtain of the testimony, and the testimony is the 10 Commandments, in the tent of meeting, Aaron is to tend the lamps before the Lord from evening till morning continually. God's making a point. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. The lamp on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord must be tended continually. Now, this pure gold lampstand, and we've all seen pictures of it, is an enduring symbol of Israel. Well, this was the lampstand that was captured by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD. So the light went out. Now, when Jesus was here, he warned Israel of this. He warned them of the destruction of the temple that would come some 38 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. He warned them about these things that were going to happen. In fact, he said in one of his I am statements, people say, well, Jesus never said he was God. He said it over and over and over. And in this particular case, he said, I am the light of the world. That's John chapter 8. Then and now, God never wanted his people in darkness. He says, take fine flour and bake 2 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah for each lamp. Now, each of the 12 tribes would be represented on this table of showbread, a symbol of fellowship. Set them in 2 rows, 6 in each row, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. Along each row, put some pure incense. Now, incense always speaks of prayer. So pure incense, our prayers need to be pure. We need to be walking in the light of Jesus Christ. The Apostle John says that he is the light. And if we're going to walk with him, we can't walk in darkness. We have to walk in the light. And if you want your prayers to be heard, that light then needs to be part of our lives. Along each row, put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be an offering made to the Lord by fire. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly. Highlight this, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. Now, I mentioned this is called the table of showbread, and this represents the fellowship of God with his people, Israel. The one thing that we should never forget is God's insatiable appetite for fellowship with you and me. God wants to hang out with you. He wants to spend time with you. And we deprive him when we get too busy or when we crowd him out of our schedules because we got other things going on. God's appetite for fellowship with you is insatiable. That's why this emphasis on Sabbath after Sabbath matters so much. God never gets enough time with each and every one of us. He says it belongs to Aaron and his sons, verse 9, who are to eat it in a holy place, because it is most holy. It is a most holy part of their regular share of the offerings made by the Lord, or made to the Lord by fire. So not only does God want a continuing, abundant relationship with each and every one of us, the relationship must be orderly. It has to be on his terms. It can't be on our terms. We got to do what he says. That will be clear throughout our study tonight. We can't just call on God when we need him. We can't just cry out to him when things are difficult. Our relationship has to be grounded, founded on our pursuit of personal holiness. Jesus said, I always and only do what pleases my Father in heaven. Now that's a lofty goal. I wish I could say it was that spiritual. That's what I want in my heart. But the reality is I fall so far short. And yet if we're going to walk with the Lord in the light, if we're going to have our prayers answered, then that relationship is going to be on his terms. We can't just decide some things are okay for us and other things are not. That's why the Word of God matters so much to each and every one of us. We come to him on his terms, not just any way that we want to. Now, obviously, while this applies to individuals, it also applies to the Church of Jesus Christ as a whole. Worship must be orderly. That's why Paul gave us so much detail and instructions about just how church is supposed to be done. So there's a foundation for chapter 24. Now God deals with protecting his name. This is important in the time that we live in. Verse 10. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him, the Egyptian son, and an Israelite. Now, we remember that when Israel left Egypt, there was a mixed multitude. The King James calls it a rabble. Egyptians left with the Israelites because they saw the power of God. They knew that the power of God was greater than the power of the little g gods that they worshipped. Now, Jewish tradition, and this is almost certainly not true, but it's interesting if we think about it a little bit. Jewish tradition claims that this Egyptian father and this son, the son was the son of the Egyptian that Moses killed, that sent him away from Egypt more than 40 years ago. This adult son by now must have gotten so sick of hearing about God, of hearing about holiness and righteousness, about all of the sacrifices, that he was just sort of fed up to hear. And the people of Israel, well, there was a fight that broke out. Verse 11 says, the son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name. That's a capital N there. That's the name I am that I am, or YHVH. We call that Yahweh, but we really don't know what the name is. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. Now, very quickly, to blaspheme in this sense, obviously he's blaspheming God, but the word means anything that we speak that is ill meant toward another person. And I add that tonight because I want to emphasize that whenever we gossip about someone, whenever we slander someone, that's the crime that we're committing. It's a sin of blasphemy. Now, not blasphemy against God, but blasphemy against the image bearers of God. We need to think about that the next time we speak ill of someone who belongs to Jesus. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. Now, if this had been an Israelite, a Jew, the Jew would have been stoned instantly, automatically. There would have been no hesitation at all. But this is wisdom. This demonstrates that this wasn't just mob rule or an emotional overreaction. This was a wise decision to take a step back and make sure that the laws that applied to Israel also applied in this particular case with a foreigner. It's a great reminder to all of us to pray before acting out. So they pray, God answers. Verse 13. Then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Now, the entire assembly, this is a testimony. Those who heard him say it, they would make that. Deuteronomy 17 talks about the truth of a matter has to be established by 2 or more witnesses. And this is just the congregation testifying against the sin of this particular man. It also meant that the condemned man would be able to hear the witnesses against him. In other words, there was nothing done in secret. False witnesses, of course, would receive the same punishment as the condemned man. And the laying on of hands here was public testimony to this man's guilt or innocence. So he says this in verse 15. Say to the Israelites, if anyone curses his God, he will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. So it applies not only to the Jew, but it also applies to the foreigner. I hope we're all beginning to understand just how seriously God takes his name. Now, I'm not going to go on a rant about this, but it's important because we so casually use the name of God. We so casually use it. And I'm not talking about, oh my God, we say those things. Those are figures of speech God understands. But when we are around God's name being taken in vain, we've got to take a stand. We've got to say something about it. God takes his name seriously. His name represents who he is. It's his character. It's his holiness. And a sin against God is a sin against the entire Israelite community. The same thing is true when people sin against God. They're sinning against the community of the Church of Jesus Christ. The entire assembly must stone him, whether an alien or native born. When he blasphemes the name, he must be put to death. Now, I told you earlier that if we're sinning against God, we're also sinning against the congregation. This is a sin against the entire Israelite community. This isn't a sin that's done in private that doesn't affect anybody. To sin against God, to blaspheme his name, would have long-term and long-ranging effects on other people, especially those who were younger. I think this sheds some light on Jesus' words to the men who wanted to stone the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. The man wasn't there, so Jesus knew that they were being disingenuous. Jesus knew that this was a trap. And so he said, let him who has no sin cast the first stone. And of course, they certainly couldn't take that responsibility. And then Jesus sort of busted him. He bent down and he wrote with his finger in the dirt. And from the oldest to the youngest, they began to leave. Whatever that Jesus wrote about them was very condemning. They realized that, wait a minute, he's aware of our sins. He's aware of the things that we've been doing. I think it also sheds light on Paul's words to the church at Corinth, when there was a man who was sinning openly, and the church was sort of amused by it. I've been getting a lot of questions on the radio show lately about discipline in the church. Had one today, had a couple last week. People want to know about discipline in the church. Discipline in the church is really, really hard. Paul said, when you know somebody's sinning, you've got to do something about it. Talk to him, one first, and then two or three others. And if he doesn't repent, then we tell it to the church. That doesn't mean we blab about the sin. It means that as a church, we take action. That's why Paul could say about this man's particular grievous sin, he said, I've already cast judgment. I've already handed this man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. And we need to deal with these kind of sins as a corporate entity. Because when we allow sin to go unchecked in the Church of Jesus Christ, then we participate in blaspheming his name. If anyone takes the life of a human being, he must be put to death. Now, sometimes we are sensitive. We don't like hearing this, but capital punishment has always come from the heart of God. From the very beginning in Genesis, if a man takes the life of another man, the idea is murder. Now later, there will be more nuanced laws against manslaughter or accidental death. But the idea here is if you murder somebody, then you're going to forfeit your life. That's just. We get people who are sort of sloppy emotionally, and they'll say, well, how can you be pro-life if you're pro-death penalty? Well, it's simple. The person who murdered someone is guilty. The babies that we're trying to protect are innocent. They haven't done anything wrong. And all of us, we can understand the difference. That's not something that's difficult for us to understand. God values human life so much that when it is abused, when it's taken, that God is going to enact justice. And capital punishment has always been in the heart of God. The answer of God to murder demonstrates that the only real way that we can value human life is to demand justice for murder. And I would add that it was swift justice. It wasn't delayed justice. It happened very quickly, and it would be a wonderful deterrent. That certainly isn't the case in the day and age that we live in. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Now, God clearly values the life of animals too, but animal life isn't on the same level as human life. Now, we live in a nutty world where there are people who claim that all life is the same and is valued the same. That's nonsense. God values life. We're to be good stewards over animals. However, there's not even a comparison between human life and animal life, and God makes that clear in these laws. He also talks about measured justice. If anyone injures his neighbor, whatever he has done must be done to him, fracture for fracture. Ouch. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured the other, so he is to be injured. Now, when we read something like that, I know about you, but that tickles my flesh. You got me, I'm going to get you worse. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But this law was given from the heart of God to limit the revenge that we would take. Not to make sure that we were avenged or that we got revenge, but to limit the punishment. You know, when the extremes of our flesh are at work, we either want too much payback, or because we're sort of emotional about it, we don't want to see anybody get punished. We don't want any punishment. And both of those extremes are way out of balance. God says, do it my way. Do it my way. Now think about something I said earlier, that Jewish tradition is that the son of who is stoned, that son is the son of the Egyptian that Moses killed. Certainly Moses would have an opinion about this. But Moses isn't given an option for an opinion. Punishment, God says, must be measured. Sort of a punishment fits the crime principle, and that comes way from the heart of God thousands of years ago. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution. Whoever kills a man must be put to death. You are to have the same law for the alien and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses. God expects each and every one of his believers to do what he tells us to do. Not just in instances like this, but in the way we live our daily lives. The Bible that you brought here tonight gives you a manual for how to live your life. When Paul writes, find out what pleases the Lord, we don't have to guess. It's in the Bibles. God says, if you do what is right, it will go well with you. Keep that in mind as we go to chapter 25. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, just as a reminder, this whole book of Leviticus takes place in about 30 days on Mount Sinai. This is the beginning. There is an Israelite in the group who knows that they're not going to come into the promised land for almost 40 years. From the time they leave Mount Sinai, there will be 38 more years of wandering around in the wilderness, because the Israelites who refused to believe God would perish in the wilderness. He says, speak to the Israelites. There's that theme again, and I keep pointing this out because we get so confused. We'll speak to the Israelites. They're God's people. Well, we're God's people, so this applies. No, this is Israel specific. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when, highlight that word when. It doesn't say if. When you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. So you're going to get there. Moses, you're going to get there. The rest of you, you're going to get there. The promises I made to you are yes and amen. This land flowing with milk and honey, you're going to get there. There are going to be times in those 38 years of wandering, there are going to be times when you think you're never going to get there. God, why haven't you kept your promise? But already God is encouraging them. He's exhorting them. When you get there, if you follow me, if you do what is right, you're going to get there. The land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years, sow your fields, and for 6 years, prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Now, this is why I introduced the Bible study the way I did tonight. God has never changed. He wants us to trust him when things are going well. He wants us to trust him when things aren't going well. He wants us to trust him when things seem impossible. We can hold on to every promise that God has made to us. God cannot break his promise. The problem is that we tend to take matters into our own hands, especially when we find ourselves going through something that's really difficult. God has always asked his people then and now to trust him. And the idea of not working, not bringing in a harvest was difficult for the men especially to accept. Our idea is, well, I'll just work harder, I'll work more, and then I will have more. When I got saved, I was running a Cadillac, Range Rover, GMC truck, and Mitsubishi dealership. And I remember thinking, Lord, you want me to trust you. Well, if I'm going to trust you, then that means I need to close on Sundays. I want to go to church. I want to take Paula to church. I want to give the people here an opportunity. I was witnessing to all of them. I was so excited about what God was doing in my life. And I made the decision to close on Sundays. Nobody in the car business did that, especially in Southern California. Now, I was in the car business long enough that I remember when there were blue laws and businesses, retail, could not open on Sundays. But that was long gone, and now I'm a Christian. I'm thinking, well, we're going to close. And everybody said, you're crazy, you're going to cost us money, what are we going to do? And I just said, you just watch and see what God is going to do. We started closing on Sundays. And our Saturdays and Mondays were so good that we never noticed any drop-off at all. And other Cadillac dealers in particular noticed that we were closing on Sunday and we were still selling more cars. And some of them began to close on Sundays. And it gave me so many opportunities just to witness to the goodness, the faithfulness of God. Some of us think we have to have a job or 2 jobs or even 3 jobs just to make ends meet, instead of saying, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do? And sometimes our only answer is, well, I'm going to work really hard. God says, how about you just come to me? I'm the Lord your God. He said that then, he says that now. Will you trust me? Faith is really the only vehicle that allows us to approach God. We got to trust him. We got to take him at his word. Dan Cathy, that I mentioned in the introduction, he's never wavered from that I'm not going to open on Sunday. It's the Lord's day stance. And people think it's crazy. Again, they're trying to enact legislation to force him to do otherwise. And he's going to do what he's always done, and God is going to do what he's always done, and that's continue to bless. Now, there's some things here to understand. One, in the prophecy of Daniel, he says there will be 7 sevens, or 7 sets of 7 years. It comes from this part of Leviticus. The 7 sevens are 7 groups of 7 years. In this particular case, we're talking about the 7th year. So on the 7th year, give the land a rest. As we know from our other Old Testament Bible studies, the Jews ignored this rule, this law, for 490 years. Think about that. For 490 years, we can all do the math. If God says you're supposed to give the land a rest for every seventh year, well, that means that they owed God 70 years so that the land could rest. God is always keeping track. God always gets what he wants done, accomplished. So Babylon comes along. They take Israel into captivity. And Jeremiah the prophet is reading the scriptures. And he realizes that we're going to be here for 70 years because we violated this law of the Sabbath for the land for 70 years. Then he started counting. We've been here 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50. We've been here almost 70 years. And he knew that the time was about up and they would return to their homeland. They owed God 70 years and God got his 70 years back. Do not reap, verse 5, what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your manservant and maidservant, and the hired worker and temporary resident who live among you. Now that's a pretty impressive list of people to feed. And God is saying, here's what I want you to do. You let the land rest, don't do any work, and the land, if you trust me, will produce all by itself. Now that doesn't make any sense. Now the greedy side of human nature is, well, if I work that extra year, then we'll just have this surplus and I'll be more secure. As well as your livestock and the wild animals in your land, whatever the land produces may be eaten. Now, later in this Bible study, we're going to read emphatically that the land belongs to God. Israel was borrowing the land. It was sort of like God was the landlord and they were the tenant. And God simply says, look, it's my land. You can work it. You can be blessed by it. But you got to do it my way or on my terms. When something belongs to God, now think about that. You and I, we belong to God. We're not our own. We're bought with a price. It means whatever belongs to God is his, and he gets to make the rules. He gets to tell us what to do. He gets to tell us how to do it. Now the question is faith. Do we really trust him? If I do things God's way, is he going to bless me? Let me just give you an example, and we've encountered that here at Calvary Chapel. We got people who won't share the gospel of Jesus Christ because they're afraid they're going to get fired at work. They won't take a stand against things that we know are sinful because they're afraid that if they do, well, God expects me to provide for my family. Will you trust the Lord? Yes, God expects you to provide for your family, but he's really the provider. He also expects you to stand for righteousness. He expects you to stand for what's right always. And we don't get to cancel one out because we're afraid of the other. God is simply saying, will you trust me? Before I ever went to Bible college, it's not about being a pastor. I was told over and over and over to stop talking about Jesus. I just couldn't. It was like a fire in me. And I had to tell people, and people said, well, you're going to upset people. You're going to lose business, or you're going to lose your job. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. I was just young enough in the Lord and just dumb enough to believe him. God's always wanted us to trust him. And that's exactly what he's asking his people Israel to do. Now, think about the things that they've seen. They've seen the Red Sea part. They're going to see God feed them. A rock is going to follow them throughout the wilderness and provide water. God is going to provide manna every single morning for those 40 years. Is that a God that we can believe? Is the God that saved you, the God that called you out of darkness? Is he a God that you can trust? And we can't separate those two. I had a question on the show today about the difference between saving faith and living faith. You can't separate those two. Grace saves through faith, but it's also true that grace through faith teaches us how to live each and every day. You can't separate those two. One doesn't negate the other. And that's what God is asking his people, Israel, to do. Now, I know how hard this is for humans. I was one of those guys. When I was beginning in the automobile business, I just decided nobody was going to work harder or longer than I was. I understood the value of hard work. I still do. But as believers, we got to balance that with the work that we do, the service that God has called us into. We think that if we work harder, there will always be more. Now, that is typically true. But it's not true when it comes to God asking you to do something. God asks you to give something up. He's going to replace it with something better. God asks you to sacrifice something for His glory. God is going to stand with you in the difficulties that you're going to face. If you're one of those people who ends up taking matters into your own hands, just be honest and ask yourself, how's that working out for you? God says, trust me in this. And we trust Him and we trust Him. And they say, no, I can't. We take matters into our own hands. How's that working out for you? And from the beginning to this very day, right here in San Antonio, Texas, God is simply asking us to trust Him. Is God asking too much of you when He asks you to trust Him? Just leave things alone, take your hands off, and let me do whatever I'm going to do. Is God asking too much of any of us when He asks us that? Now, each one of us has to supply our own answer. Now, this develops even more. Now we get to the year of Jubilee. This is glorious. Verse 8. Count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Now, every 50 years was this Jubilee celebration. Now, here's a problem with this Jubilee celebration. We have no record in the Old Testament at all of Jews ever observing the Jubilee. They knew about it. It was taught. It was proclaimed. But we have no record whatsoever of them obeying. It's simply like, God put this thing out there. I'm going to bless you. Trust me. And on the 50th year, and essentially this would be 2 years of the land being left alone, the 49th year, and then on the 50th year. And God is going to say, if you just trust me, I'm going to blow your mind. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Does that sound familiar to anybody? That's what's inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Our founding fathers inscribed, proclaim liberty throughout the land on the Liberty Bell. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family, property, and each to his own claim. Now, not only were slaves set free on this day. Now remember, people would have to sell themselves into slavery time. They'd get into financial problems. For some people, it was the only way that they could survive. And God is saying, you're never going to be a slave. God's people should never be a slave. Paul says, once we were slaves to sin, now we're slaves to righteousness. The same principle works for you and for me. But the slaves were to be set free, and land was to return to its original owner. God never intended that there would be land barons. God never intended that there would be monopolies on the land. God always intended that the land would go back to the people to whom it belonged. We remember when Joshua went into the promised land. He allocated the land as the Lord led, and the land was given to the tribes. If that land had to be sold for financial difficulties or any other reasons, well, this would ensure that the land would always go back to the people for whom it was intended. And remember, it's God's land, so He can do with it what He wants. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow, do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines, for it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. If you sell land to one of your countrymen or buy any from him, do not take advantage of each other. One of the things you got to do in business, whether it's thousands of years ago or today, is you've got to conduct yourself honorably, fairly. The idea that this is a dog-eat-dog world, you got to do what the competition does. I've shared this with you before, but it's been a long enough time that maybe it'll mean something to you. But I remember after I got saved, I couldn't do business the way I'd always done business before. And I was bound and determined to do things God's way. And it was really hard to sell cars without lying, to treat my employees with respect and honor. All those things were really, really difficult. And I remember begging the Lord, and this is when I knew I was called to be a pastor. I just said, Lord, I want to show the world. I was very successful in business, and I said, Lord, I believe with all of my heart that if I went back into business and did things your way, I'd be more successful than I ever dreamed possible. And he answered me, he said, you would be. So, Lord, can I go back and do that? He goes, no. Paul always tells me, we teach, he says, Pastor Ron, you have a job. But he wanted me to understand that doing things his way would be blessed, but in this particular case, now I've got another calling. I'm still convinced that I could go into any business, retail business, car dealership or otherwise, and do it God's way. And he would bless so abundantly, we'd wonder why we need all of these schemes and techniques to do anything at all. Why not just treat people the way God would treat them? And with all of my heart, I believe that God would bless that abundantly. That's what he's saying. Do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your countrymen on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee. And he is to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price. And when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what he's really selling you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other. Highlight this, but fear God. And then he highlights it, or puts his own exclamation mark on it by saying, I am the Lord your God. Now, here's the problem. The Israelites, just like you and me, they believed that the land was theirs. And they would come with all kinds of loopholes. Jews would work their land for 6 years. And when the 7th year it was supposed to rest, they would let it out to Gentiles, to Arabs. The Arabs would pay them so they would still get paid. And their supposition was, well, it's not me working the land, so it's okay. God says, no, trust me. The land belonged to God, and it must be dealt with integrity. Now, I told you earlier, Paul writes, you're not your own, you're bought with a price. Your life has to be a life of integrity, character. We reflect the light of Jesus Christ. We can't be like other people. We can't do things the way other people do it. It's so easy. We go to work and we see other people lying. We see other people taking shortcuts. We see other people cheating or stealing, and we think, well, that's what you have to do to get along. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Well, it's not a dog-eat-dog world for a Christian. Our light, remember the lampstand from the very beginning of our study, has to be tended continually. We've got to check our hearts. We've got to examine our hearts, check our motives. Everything that we do has to have the singular goal of pleasing our Father in heaven. And if we do that, we're going to see that God will really take care of us. All they had to do was listen and obey. Look at verse 18. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then, the preposition in verse 19 is important. If you don't follow my decrees, and if you don't obey my laws, there's not going to be a then. Do it God's way, then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, I love this because God is anticipating our human nature. You may ask, well, what will we eat in the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? God's answer is simply this: trust me. I'm promising you that you're going to eat. Well, how am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to pay my bills if I don't work extra, if I don't do whatever it takes to get ahead? God is saying, trust me. And I think in our world, we've just forgotten all about really trusting the Lord. Do we really believe that doing things His way will result in blessing? Well, that's why God asked the question. He knows what they were thinking then. He knows what we're thinking even now. And again, even though God did so many miraculous things, the people still question God's goodness. And they immediately start obsessing over the things that they were afraid of. And that's why God takes the initiative here to encourage them. He says in verse 21, I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. That's 7, 8, and 9. God's saying, if you trust me, then that land will produce so much that you won't have to worry about it for a very long time. And you can enjoy rest in the land. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. Now, this is not prosperity theology. This is just God saying, when you do things my way, then my promises are going to be yours. We go all the way back to Cain. Cain, if you do what is right, will it not go well with you? Is there anyone here who believes this isn't as true today in 2023 as it was back when this instruction was given to Moses? Do we really believe it? Now, we may make intellectual assent. We may say, well, yeah, I know God is faithful, but practically, do we really believe it? Do we do what God says? I remember as a Christian, one of the very first meetings I had in the car business, a room full of people. And I told them, from this point forward, nobody ever lies. If you lie, you will not work here. Plain and simple. They came up to me afterwards and said, well, you weren't serious about that, right? Yeah, I really am. If you lie, you won't work here. Well, we can't sell cars without lying. Everybody lies. And I told them, we're going to trust God. Now, they thought I was whack. They thought I was absolutely a nut, and they talked about me, but God always was there. He always showed off. Obedience equals blessing. We need to believe it. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. And by the way, verse 23 is emphatic, and it is just as true today as it was then. When we look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, it means that Gaza and the West Bank still belongs to God. It means that all of the politicians trying to argue for a two-state solution are fighting against God. That will never happen. It means all of the people protesting Israel's so-called aggression and defending themselves. I know that's a contradiction in terms, but that's what they're saying. They don't understand. This is God's land. He can give it to whom He chooses, and He's already given it to them. And even Jews today, the Israelites, the politicians don't believe that. And that's why they've joined in negotiating away the land for years and years and years. In fact, since 1948, they win land in a war and immediately are forced by the world to negotiate the land that they want away. And God is in heaven going, oy vey. There'll never be a two-state solution. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. Now, this is where we're going to close here tonight. But I remind you these two things. I just spoke about the first one. The land belongs to God, all of it. Second, the application for us of this entire Bible study is, to whom do we belong? When we decide we're going to do things our way, when we decide it's okay to tell little lies, when we decide it's okay to take shortcuts because everybody else is and we're competing with other people, especially in the workplace, then we cease to acknowledge that we belong to God. And we become our own master, and we simply don't do very well when we're the ones who are calling the shots. My final reminder is that obedience equals blessing, whether it's for Israel or for you or for me. The land, you and me, we belong to God. He calls the shots. He makes the rules. All he wants is for you to trust him. Abraham believed God. We say, well, I believe in God, but it's not the same as believing God every day. This Bible study tonight is a challenge to believe him, to take him at his word. Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. We have the power that raised Christ from the dead living in us. We know it, but do we believe it? And only you can supply that answer. Father, as we close tonight, I want to thank you for what you've done in my heart with this Bible study.